Our next speaker, Thomas ONeill, is the director, founder, and lead ecologist for the Habitat Institute, a nonprofit 501c3 scientific and educational organization. He's worked for 40 years as a wildlife ecologist in the West and 35 years as a certified wildlife biologist. Experience related to this presentation include developing a framework and method called Combined Habitat Assessment Protocols for assessing ecological systems and resiliency. His work has produced the first patent in the US for an algorithm for assessing habitat value, creating and implementing a new dimension of performance called a functional redundancy index value, implementing proof of concept projects, and defending the concept in a host of independent scientific reviews. Additionally, Tom's other work has helped to list the first listed fish species in the US. Tom has several degrees and also has held an associate faculty status at the University of Chicago and Oregon State University. He will be addressing ecological resiliency using functional redundancy. Now, I have really no idea what that means. I'm just dying to hear what this guy has to say.
So am I.
Yeah, he doesn't know either. We're all going to learn together.
I'm waiting breathlessly to say what I'm going to say. Today, what I'm going to introduce you to is a new knowledge of innovation, and it produces a new dimension of performance called the Functional Redundancy Index. We believe it's the first time in 45 years that the wildlife ecology habitat realm has a new metric. But before I get going into and just showing you what it looks like, I'm going to tell you a story. And we're going to start with your lead person tomorrow, Jordan Smith. Jordan Smith's book is on Engineering Eden. And it's appropriate for this topic because if you would allow me a few minutes here, I'd say let's put a chapter on the end of Jordan's book and call it Valuing Nature. Okay? The reason is those characters in his book all valued nature, but they came at it from a different perspective. And that's what we're going to do today. We value nature, and I'm going to show you how to value nature, not price nature. We're going to try to take a look at that and show you how it works. The second part is that I know this is presumption, but if you read the book, it opens up with a young man being killed by an old grizzly bear at Old Faithful. And it happened on June 25th, 1972. What you don't know is I was there in Yellowstone, 17 miles away. And to collaborate that, my wife is here. I just met her 10 days earlier, and guess when her birthday is? June 25th, not 1972, but June 25th. Sorry about that. Okay, anyway, I was aware of, or I worked with many of the characters that were described in the book. I was a guy that followed John Craighead to the University of Montana, and I did my graduate work there. Now, I ended up, when I graduated, on the bear floor. Okay, my roommate in graduate school became Mr. Idaho black bear. I put up the first Oregon black bear study later on, and 2 hours down was the grizzly bear interagency project study. Okay, so we had sort of an idea of kind of what's going on, and after that I moved around out of graduate school into a number of different projects. Now, these are the ones that I started to work on. The Eagle was sort of a recovery deal, and it brings back fine memories on me because that's the first time somebody's pulled a gun on me in pursuit of a wildlife assessment. Okay, so this was just the endangered species were coming out implementing. Second one, I moved into the gray wolf down to central Idaho. 10 years before Yellowstone was introduced, the gray wolf back into the Yellowstone. That has fond memories for it too. That's the second time somebody's pulled a gun on me in a pursuit of a wildlife assessment. So after that, I realized I maybe would move on, and I got an offer, come down to Kern County, Naval Petroleum Reserves 1 and 2, the work on a kit fox, blunt-nosed leopard lizard, and kangaroo rat. Okay? What we didn't know when I got in there was there was a $1 billion worth of oil and gas being generated off that site, and it was split about 50-50 between Chevron and the Department of Energy. So when I drafted the first Jeopardy opinion on the kit facts, the place exploded. And one and one, believe me, came up 111. There's a GOA investigation. So I got tired of being threatened and having guns pulled on me. I said, I'm going to go do something else. So I was going to go hide out in Western Oregon, took a job as a West Side researcher in wildlife. And I'll never forget the night in early 1990s when Charlie Bruce came to me and said, we got to start collecting some data on some bird species. And we're trying to pull the federal data together, and they're out of money, and you're in research, could you help us out? I said, well, which ones? He says, well, it's a forest owl and a seabird. I said, okay, we could probably do that. And he said, I remember his words clearly. He says, well, how much trouble can we really get into? Well, it turns out we got into a lot of trouble. That was the spotted owl and the marble murrelet. And the place came unglued, brought in 3 states, the federal folks were involved, the president was having a forest summit there, and we're going, wow. So I was lucky enough to get spun out of wildlife research into fish research just in time to catch the salmon thing head right on, right? So I'm pretty convinced at this point I'm seeing the collapse of our wildlife resources. So, but in the whole debacle there, one of the things that kept resonating with that came up was, how much is a spotted owl worth? I thought, we need to figure out, how do we value nature? That's a good question. So I started looking around. There wasn't anything on crashes with wildlife ecosystems or anything like that at that point, but there was something on the stock market, 1929. So I thought, well, we'll see how they were able to get back up on their feet and get things resilient. Well, there was a guy there from Columbia University named Benjamin Graham. He wrote a book, still in existence today, and you probably haven't heard of him, but I'll bet you've heard of his graduate student that went through in 1950. His name was Warren Buffett. Okay. And what it was they were trying to broaden the field to get more companies in, but they were trying to produce a metric that was pertinent to the companies so people could make better investments. I thought, that's exactly what we need to do. Is we got to come up with doing the exact same thing. The first thing we've got to do is change our perspective. And I want to tell you, you've probably heard it before, the Native Americans had it right. We've got to look through the eyes and lives of fish and wildlife. And when you start to look at that, things start to change. You've got to look at it and say, how would they see the landscape, not how we see the landscape. So what do you do? Well, my training says you go back into the literature. The answer's in the literature. So like a couple of fools, we raised some hundred thousands of dollars. We went out and we looked at over 100,000 references. We brought in 10,000. We had people lined up to go through them to peruse this, to get the information out. And after 10 months, we declared it an epic failure because the answer is not in the literature. And I remember that Dave, who was with me on this, came out and I said, we got good news and bad news. And he goes, what's that? I said, well, it's the literature thing's a failure. He goes, that's the good news? What's the bad news is? We got to go out and do it again. But this time, we found out it's in people's heads. That's where the information was. It was in gray literature. It was things that people worked in daily. So we ended up forming peer panel processes to do that. And by the time the dust was settled, we had over 700 people involved with this to give us their vision of what they thought it came out. Out of that also, we didn't discard everything. We produced an information system that we could pull in behind these data sets and put it into a geographic information system as well. We use GIS because, believe it or not, most people are visual learners, and believe it or not, if you're dealing with resource managers and policy people, they like maps. So, we can put a lot of complexity in a map, and we're able to pull some of that information out for them. Now, the vision that we had at the time was we're going to bring in all the range maps in the states or regions, and we're going to be able to someday click on a button and immediately get a peer-reviewed list of species based on the range maps. And from there, we could hook up the information system to it, and we could look at the habitat types and all these other life history characteristics to bring this all together. And guess what? It's here. We can do that. Everywhere across the state of California, we've done it. We can do that. We've done it in the entire Pacific Northwest. Now, in so doing, what happens is that we have to develop some new terms. And one of them was the key environmental correlates. And what are those? That's the fine-featured habitat elements that we think influences a species distribution, viability, and abundance. Why? Because the peer experts said, we think this is what happens. So we ran with it. The other part was, and there's about 250 of them we've listed. So from a species perspective, what that looks like is, what is the species tied to? Does it tie to oxbows, snags? Is it different coarse woody debris? That type of thing. So you're able to pull that up for every species that we've got. The other thing we had to do is, and this is interesting, we tried to, what's a fully functioning system? We go around, we hear the term all the time, well, it's properly functioning. What is that? Well, it's when we see it, we know it. So we decided, well, we're going to define it. And what it is, it's how organisms influence the environment. Define ecology. Ecology is organism to organism, or organism in relationship to their environment. One of the most important data sets that's in this state that's totally underused is the California WHRs. They've been starting since the 80s. It's gone up early on, and it's sort of languished in the past. We look at that every day when we're down here in California. So you get an idea of what the species does. So does it create runways? Does it eat fish? Does it create secondary cavity nesters? Does it primary excavators? Those types of things. We're able to do that. So what happens is, think of this in terms of, you've probably heard of, if you're an ecologist, food webs. Broaden your vision. Functional web. Includes the food web, just includes what is it they do. Okay? I don't want to get too much involved because that's a whole nother story. But what it does is, the minute you're able to do this, you can start to look at functional redundancies, profiles for a site. You can see, based on the potential species list, what functions possibly could be there. If you review the species list by the local experts and you're trying to get people involved in the local community, they'll tell you what's going on, and they're going to say, these are the lists, go out and talk to Mary Jo about bats or whatever, and you go out and you do that type of thing. But all of a sudden, you're able to start to tunnel in on a functional profile and show what's going on. You're able to list the high functioning areas. You're also able to list the low functional areas. You can look at those species that are functional specialists. They only perform a few functions. You got to pay attention to them if you want to keep a fully functioning system. Or you can look at keystone functions, species, and just a little different, broader definition, in the sense that they're the only species, and it can be a common one, that performs a function in a habitat type. You can identify these. If you're fortunate enough to have actual information, you can look to see where you're on, what's potential versus real, see where you're at from a resiliency standpoint. So you've got these type of things able to help you sort out some things and inform not only that, but also restoration. So how do you get to the values of this thing? We start out with Boolean logic. Boolean logic, in case you didn't know, is listed as one of the top 100 inventions ever by, well, National Geographic anyways. So it's done by George Bull. It's the zeros and ones. It was open and closed. We could look at true, false, yes, no. Our case is absence, presence. And it's just what you do is you get the species list. And what we're talking about here, we're running hundreds of species and hundreds of functions, and we can also get habitat components run concurrently to do this. So you start to look at it just very simply, 4 functions, there's 9 ones in there, and you can list the species that the acorn woodpecker disperses seeds, for example. So the next one, you look at the habitat component, and this is a little bit different, but it's how does habitat structure support species to do their functions. So if you have a snag, you obviously support a species that can create a snag, okay? So there's stuff like that going on in this. So it gets back into, again, the functional web, but here you got 5 functions, 14 ones, and that will give you the matrix that you're looking for, which is the number of a functional redundancy index by just 9 divided by 4, 14 divided by 5, they're added together, they give you a per acre value of 5.1. Now, it's a very simple example, but that's where it goes. And then if you times it to number of acres, you'll get the total value of it. And this is what we've had to defend in front of the science groups that we've been working with. So this is it. We're almost ready to do our happy dance right here. But there's 2 problems we have. Actually, there's 3 problems we have. First of all, the one is, okay, we came up with this metric, so what? Right? I mean, how do you know it's a good metric, and how do you know if it's something that's marketable? So we talked to some people, and they said, well, it looks like you're dealing with functional resiliency or the health of a system. You know, you need to get a patent. The fastest way is go get a patent on it. And they said, okay, what does it take, 3 years? All right, since you're dealing with the health of the system, go to the Institute of National Health Patent Lawyers. They'll get it. So we did. We showed up. We showed up with 31 claims. When I said, let's go do it, we're going to do it, and they said, well, sit down. That isn't the way the patent world works. You know, and you kind of go, of course not. So you start going through that process. You'll be lucky to get a couple. You know, rock star status, you're at 8 or 10 or whatever the number is, but you're not going to get 31, buddy. And we see you, a lot of guys, you all the time. You may not get any. So I thought, okay, so we jump on that and we start going forward into the process. And of course, with my luck, you know, the Supreme Court decides they're going to look at a case that's going to revamp the patent office, right? So anyway, 3.5 years later, I've got the patent lawyer from the National Institute of Health involved. I got 2 pro bono lawyers from Intel involved, and we're trying to figure out if we're tied up with the Bilski decision. You know? So anyway, 2 weeks before they give the Bilski decision out, we get a call from the patent office, and they said, you know, you got the patent. And I thought, yes, all right. I told you it was in ecology. It was going to work. It's worth it. Yeah, good. How many claims we get? We get rock star status. No, didn't get rock star status. I thought, oh gosh, okay, here we go. They said, we're standing there, a group of lawyers are standing there looking at this. We've never seen this quite like this. And they said, what is it? And they said, you got all 31 claims. I thought, yes, way to go. Now, of course, my wife, who's ever the practicist, I'm starting to do my happy dance, and she goes, well, no, wait a minute, now you got another problem. You've got a metric that nobody even knows about, let alone use. You've got to get somebody to adopt it, and then you got to get through the science reviews, right? So, just so happens in 2007, two things happened, one in Oregon, one down here in California, almost within a month or two apart. The first one was an independent scientific review panel that was looking at the habitat evaluation procedures out of the Fish and Wildlife Service, deemed them scientifically outdated, and they wanted them stopped. Well, the state of Oregon took that and said, are you telling me we have a mitigation claim out there for 25 years that's worth, we think, $300 or $400 million? We just lost that opportunity? Is that what you're just telling us? They said, we're not going to take HEP anymore. If you come up with another way to get back to it, we'll look at it. So they called us up and said, can you get it? And we said, yeah, we can get that. I can back shoot that. I was involved with HEP 2 many, many years ago. And within 9 months, they settled for a $150 million settlement, plus 2 other projects for another $42 million. They got ended up with a $192 million settlement on that. So that was the first thing. And they sponsored us in the science review process. And for the first time, a governor of any state that I'm aware of has endorsed a habitat evaluation approach. I was like, wow, that's different. The other thing that happened was down here, there was again with HEP, they were over at Big Bear Lake. They were trying to figure out how many species they needed. They'd worked with it for 5 a year, and they were trying to decide what 5 they were going to use. Finally, they found out about us, and they said, can you just come down and just do it? We picked the 5, we don't care. We said, well, how many species you got? And he says, I don't know, we got about probably 140. I said, we'll just run all those. They go, oh, wait, time out. What are we doing? You know, they're not used to that. So, and the other part was they also started to work on Los Angeles River. It was all concrete. They had no method that would allow them to do that either. So, from a per acre value standpoint, it starts to map it on the ground. It looks something like this. We color code it for the consumer report. Red's not so good, blue's good. Doesn't mean you can't do good things to blue. It's just where we're at this point in time. Here's the Prado Basin, largest riparian intact area in southern California, and that has over 500 polygons, just to give you an example. Now, from a method standpoint, you got to be able, and this is your younger group here, you got to be able to deal with a historical method, and you got to deal with virtual methods. You got to be able to deal with the virtuality of the system nowadays. If you're not, you might as well go home. Here's the historical method. We found the 1896 map on linen paper. We were able to pick it up, snap it in GIS, and tell them where you think you even stand a chance of getting ecosystem function back. Here's another way of looking at it. If you're doing mitigation, avoid, minimize, and then mitigate. Here it was coming down I-5. Do you put the bridge, a temporary bridge on the right or left side? Simply with the key environmental correlates, you're able to sort that out. The difference in our method, I'll just jump to it really quickly, is that if you do a wetland assessment right now and you assess the wetland, we would generate you a score of, say, 622. You got to get the 622 back, and it's above baseline. It's not, 1 or 2 acres or 2 for 1. Those are policy decisions. Those are not science. But we have an ability to do that. We also have the ability to deal with individual species that can nest within mitigation banking systems. You start to do the simulation pieces so people can start saying, what if? What if we did this? What if we did that? You can start to rate these and score those and get the better environmental stuff. From the San Francisco Bay, we're looking at this just to give you a simulation over time. You're only as good as the information you've got to be able to get you through the system and look at what you think the habitats are going to look like over the next 50 years. We can track that. This is all very transparent. You have to put the points in so that you'll be able to do that. You can look at the redundancy values of saline marsh, look at those, and you can also look at riparian areas, look at those. Why are those important? Because what happens is trade-off analysis. We don't even talk about functional trade-offs. If you go from one spot A to the next spot B, and we say acres-wise, we're doing it now, they're equivalent. They're not equivalent. You got to know what you're trading off in the system. If you can't do that, this may require you later on to create actually banks to collect functions that are totally being avoided within the system, if that's your goal. The other part, it does work in natural resource damage assessments. And why is that? Because the key environmental correlates don't change. They're still there. You can still look at that. You can, again, simulate them if you need to. But there's ways to be able to get at that. We've gone through a number of presentations with NOAA and their lawyers and all that stuff. And it's Daubert ready, not Dilbert ready. That was just quality. Anyway, and ideally, here's the other thing. We talk about planning. Does this method work in a conservation strategy? And the answer is yes, it does. We've done the Southern California Association of Governments, 6 counties, using this approach. And it's the first time the habitat approach has actually been a principal component driving the systems. And then for GRINS, we also did Northwest Oregon. This is the areas the size of France, and it's about 60 sub-basin plans, watersheds, and we put out up over 5,000 files to help people make informed decisions about what they were doing. So I know this has been moving probably fast, talking for the younger people, and the older folks are probably going, geez, it's 40-mile-an-hour winds coming through here. So anyway, that's basically it.